The morning mist clung to the windows of the Cook County Courthouse in Chicago like a bad omen. Julia Martinez adjusted her navy blazer for the third time, her hands trembling despite the caffeine coursing through her veins. She'd barely slept, the night before, replaying every possible scenario of how this divorce hearing might unfold. After 15 years of marriage, she thought she knew Mark well enough to predict his moves. She was wrong. The limestone steps of the courthouse felt like climbing a mountain as Julia made her way through the metal detectors. Her lawyer, Patricia Hendricks, was already waiting in the lobby, her silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun that had intimidated opposing counsel for over 2 decades. "You ready for this, Julia?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying the weight of experience. She'd seen it all: nasty custody battles, hidden assets, affairs that destroyed families. But even she seemed unusually tense this morning. "As ready as anyone can be for their marriage to officially end," Julia replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the sleepless nights that had become her norm since Mark had served her papers 3 months ago. They walked toward courtroom 506, their heels clicking against the polished marble floor, in an echo that seemed to announce their presence to the entire building. Other couples and their attorneys filled the hallways, some looking resigned, others angry, a few appearing relieved. Julia wondered which category she fell into. Probably all 3. As they approached the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, Julia's phone buzzed. A text from her sister Carmen. "You've got this, Hermana. Remember, you're a Martinez woman. We don't back down from fights." The message brought a small smile to Julia's face, reminding her of their grandmother's words. "Una mujer fuerte no se rompe, se dobla y se endereza más fuerte." A strong woman doesn't break. She bends and straightens back up stronger. Patricia pushed open the courtroom doors, and Julia followed, her eyes immediately scanning the room for Mark. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, with rows of wooden benches facing the judge's bench. The smell of old wood and legal documents filled the air, along with an underlying tension that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. And then she saw them. Time seemed to freeze as Julia's eyes locked onto the scene that would be burned into her memory forever. There was Mark, her Mark, walking confidently down the center aisle of the courtroom. His dark hair was freshly cut, styled in that way she used to run her fingers through during their Sunday morning coffee routine. He wore his best charcoal suit, the one she'd bought him for their 10th anniversary dinner at Alinea. But it wasn't Mark alone that made Julia's breath catch in her throat. It was the woman beside him. She was young, maybe 25, with long blonde hair that cascaded over her shoulders like she'd stepped out of a shampoo commercial. Her skin had that dewy glow that only came with youth and expensive skincare routines. She wore a form-fitting red dress that hugged curves Julia remembered having 20 years ago, paired with designer heels that probably cost more than Julia's monthly car payment. But what shattered Julia's composure wasn't the woman's appearance. It was the way Mark held her hand. Not just holding, intertwining their fingers with the kind of intimate familiarity that spoke of countless private moments. The way he used to hold Julia's hand during their early dating years, when every touch felt electric and full of promise. The woman looked up at Mark with obvious adoration, and he squeezed her hand in response, bringing it briefly to his lips for a gentle kiss. Julia felt her world tilt on its axis. The courthouse sounds, shuffling papers, hushed conversations, the bailiff's instructions, all faded into white noise. Her vision tunneled, focusing solely on this devastating tableau of betrayal playing out in front of her. Julia, are you all right?" Patricia's voice seemed to come from far away. The younger woman was saying something to Mark, her voice carrying across the courtroom with a slight southern accent. "Baby, are you sure we should be so public about this? I mean, she's right there." Mark's response cut through Julia like a blade. "Let her see, Amber. She needs to understand that this is over. that I've moved on, that we've moved on. The casual cruelty in his voice, the same voice that had whispered "I love you" into her ear just 6 months ago, made Julia's stomach lurch. This wasn't the man who'd promised to love her in sickness and in health, for better or worse. This wasn't the man who'd held her hand during her mother's funeral, who'd stayed up all night when she had food poisoning, who'd danced with her in their kitchen to old salsa songs. Or maybe it was exactly that man, and she'd been blind to his true nature all along. Patricia's hand on her arm brought Julia back to the present. Breathe, Julia. Just breathe. Don't give him the satisfaction of seeing you break. But Julia was already breaking. The humiliation burned hot in her chest, spreading through her body like wildfire. Mark had planned this. He'd deliberately brought this woman, Amber, apparently, to their divorce hearing. He'd wanted Julia to see them together, wanted to twist the knife one final time. The bailiff called for order as Judge Margaret Thornton entered the courtroom. She was a woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen every form of human drama play out in her courtroom. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for games and theatrics. As everyone rose for the judge, Julia caught another glimpse of Mark and Amber. They were whispering to each other, and Julia could swear she heard Amber giggle. Actually giggle. In a divorce courtroom, while Julia's 15-year marriage was being legally dissolved. "Please be seated," Judge Thornton commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been handling family court for over 20 years. "We're here today for the matter of Martinez versus Martinez. Will the parties and their counsel please approach?" This was it. The moment Julia had been dreading for months. She stood on unsteady legs, Patricia's steadying hand still on her arm. As they walked toward the counsel table, Julia became acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom watching her. She could feel the pity radiating from the other attorneys, the curiosity from the court staff, and worst of all, the satisfied smugness emanating from Mark's direction. Mark's attorney, Richard Steinberg, was everything Julia had expected. Expensive suit, calculating eyes, and a reputation for playing dirty when necessary. He'd made his career representing wealthy men who wanted to minimize their losses in divorce proceedings. The fact that Mark had hired him told Julia everything. She needed to know about how this battle was going to be fought. "Your Honor," Steinberg began, his voice smooth as silk. "My client is seeking a straightforward dissolution of marriage. The parties have been separated for 3 months, and my client believes they can reach an amicable settlement regarding asset division and support obligations." Amicable. The word tasted bitter in Julia's mouth. There was nothing amicable about parading your mistress in front of your soon-to-be ex-wife. There was nothing amicable about the way Mark was now sitting with his arm casually draped around Amber's shoulders, as if they were at dinner rather than in a courtroom destroying a marriage. Patricia stood, her voice steady and professional. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to proceed, but we have concerns about the respondent's financial disclosures and his conduct during these proceedings." Judge Thornton's eyes swept the courtroom, and Julia watched as they stopped on Mark and Amber. The judge's expression didn't change, but Julia caught a flicker of something. Disapproval, perhaps, in her eyes. "Mr. Martinez," the judge said, her tone carefully neutral. "I trust you understand that these proceedings require a certain level of decorum and respect for all parties involved." Mark stood, his confidence unshaken. "Of course, Your Honor. I'm simply here with my fiancé for moral support." Fiancé. The word hit Julia like a physical blow. They were engaged. Not only had Mark moved on, but he'd already proposed to this woman. The timeline made Julia's head spin. When had this relationship even started? How long had Mark been lying to her face? Amber held up her left hand, showing off a diamond ring that caught the courtroom's fluorescent lights. It was massive, easily 2 carats, set in platinum. Julia's engagement ring, which she'd thought was beautiful 15 years ago, suddenly felt like a joke in comparison. The judge's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Martinez, while I appreciate that you may have personal support and attendance. I would ask that you conduct yourself with appropriate consideration for these proceedings and for your estranged wife. But Mark was already pushing boundaries. Further. As they returned to their seats, he leaned over and kissed Amber full on the mouth, right there in the courtroom. It wasn't a quick peck. It was the kind of passionate kiss that belonged in private, not in a court of law. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. Julia felt her face burn with humiliation. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and never emerge. But then she caught sight of Judge Thornton's face, and for the first time that morning, she felt a flicker of something other than devastation. The judge was not pleased. At all. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Thornton's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "I will remind you that this is a court of law, not a venue for public displays of affection. If you cannot conduct yourself appropriately, I will have you removed from these proceedings." Steinberg quickly stood, damage control mode activated. "Your Honor, my client apologizes for his enthusiasm. It won't happen again." But Mark was apparently just getting started. As they began discussing preliminary matters, he made a show of checking his phone, whispering to Amber, even laughing at something she said during a particularly serious moment about asset division. Each display of disrespect felt like another knife in Julia's back. This was the man she'd supported through law school, working 2 jobs while he studied. This was the man she'd nursed through pneumonia, who'd promised her children they'd never had, because he kept saying they should wait until his career was more established. This was the man who'd shared her bed, her dreams, her life for 15 years. And now he was treating her like she was nothing, like their marriage had been nothing, like she was an inconvenience to be dispensed with as quickly as possible so he could start his shiny new life with his shiny new fiancée. But as Julia sat there, absorbing blow after emotional blow, something began to shift inside her. The shock and humiliation were giving way to something else. Something harder. Something that reminded her of her grandmother's words, of her sister's text, of the Martinez women who had faced down challenges for generations. She was not going to be Mark's victim. She was not going to be the pathetic ex-wife who got discarded for a younger model. She was not going to let him walk away with everything, while she got nothing but heartbreak and public humiliation. For the first time since walking into that courtroom, Julia Martinez felt something other than devastation. She felt angry, and in that anger, she found her strength. As the preliminary hearing concluded and they scheduled the next session, Julia made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't just going to fight for her fair share of their assets. She was going to fight for justice. She was going to make sure that Mark's betrayal and cruelty didn't go unanswered. Walking out of the courthouse, Patricia noticed the change in her client immediately. "Julia, you look different." Julia squared her shoulders, looking back at the courthouse where her old life had officially ended. "I am different, Patricia. And we're going to make sure Mark regrets the day he decided to humiliate me in that courtroom." The war was just beginning. 3 days after the courthouse humiliation, Julia sat in her favorite corner booth at Café Luna, a small Cuban restaurant in Pilsen where she'd been coming since college. The familiar scents of Café Cubano and garlic-laden picadillo usually comforted her, but today she barely noticed them. Spread across the worn wooden table were bank statements, credit card bills, and a legal pad covered in Patricia's neat handwriting. "Tell me everything," Patricia said, sliding into the booth across from Julia. The older woman had changed from her courtroom attire into jeans and a Northwestern University sweatshirt, making her look more like someone's professor aunt than a feared divorce attorney. "And I mean everything. When did you first suspect something was wrong?" Julia stirred her cortadito, watching the sugar dissolve in spirals. "Looking back, maybe 6 months ago, Mark started working late more often. Weekend client meetings. That never seemed to end. He was always on his phone, but he'd get secretive about it, turning the screen away from me, taking calls in the other room. Classic signs. Patricia nodded, making notes. What about financially? Any unusual spending? That's the thing that really gets me. Julia's voice hardened. I thought we were being careful with money. Mark always handled the investments in our savings account. He said I didn't need to worry about it, that he had everything under control. She pulled out a bank statement, her finger tracing a series of withdrawals. But look at this. $50,000 withdrawn from our joint savings account over the past 4 months. Cash withdrawals, certified checks made out to cash. Patricia's eyebrows rose. 50,000? What did he say when you asked about it? I never got the chance. He filed for divorce the week after I started asking questions about our finances. Julia's laugh was bitter. I was so stupid, Patricia. I trusted him completely. I let him handle everything financial while I focused on my job at the community center. The waitress, Marisol, approached with a concerned expression. She'd known Julia for years, had watched her relationship with Mark evolve from young love to comfortable marriage. Mija, you need to eat something. You're getting too skinny. Julia accepted the plate of ropa vieja Marisol set in front of her, though her appetite had been non-existent since the courtroom disaster. Gracias, Mari. As Marisol walked away, Patricia leaned forward. Julia, I need you to think. Were there any joint accounts Mark didn't know you had access to? Any credit cards in your name only? Any assets he might not have declared? Actually, yes. Julia's eyes lit up for the first time in days. My grandmother left me some jewelry when she died 5 years ago. Mark never liked it, said it was too old-fashioned. So I kept it in a safety deposit box at the bank near my work. He doesn't even know which bank I use for my personal checking account. Good. What else? Julia pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos. I've been documenting things since I got suspicious. Look at this. She showed Patricia a screenshot of Mark's Instagram story from 2 weeks ago. A photo of an expensive dinner at Gibson's Steakhouse. This was the night he told me he was working late on the Henderson case. But look at the table. 2 wine glasses, and you can see a woman's hand with that same ring Amber was wearing. Patricia studied the image carefully. This is excellent. Julia, what else do you have? More than I realized. Julia pulled up her cloud storage. I started backing up his phone to our shared cloud account last year when he kept losing important client information. He never turned it off, so I have access to his photos, messages, even his location history. The lawyer's eyes gleamed. Please tell me you documented everything before he knew you had access. Better than that. Julia's voice carried a note of satisfaction. I printed everything and gave copies to my sister Carmen. She's keeping them at her house, and she scanned everything to her personal cloud storage. Mark doesn't even know Carmen exists. He always dismissed my family as unimportant. Smart woman. What did you find in those messages? Julia's expression darkened. The affair started 8 months ago. They met at some legal conference in Miami. The messages, they're explicit, Patricia. Not just sexual, but financial. Amber kept asking him when he was going to deal with the wife problem, so they could start their real life together. And his responses? He told her he was working on it, that he'd already moved most of their assets to accounts I couldn't access. That once the divorce was final, they'd have enough money to buy a house in Lincoln Park and start fresh. Julia's hands clenched into fists. He was planning this for months, Patricia. Everything was calculated. Even the way he served me papers. He waited until I was at my mother's funeral to have me served. I was standing at her graveside when the process server showed up. Patricia sat back, her expression grim. Jesus, Julia. I've seen some cold-hearted moves in my time, but that's particularly cruel. It gets worse. Julia pulled out another set of documents. I did some digging on Amber. Her full name is Amber Sinclair, and she's not just some random woman Mark met. She's a paralegal at Steinberg's firm, his lawyer's firm. This whole thing has been coordinated from the beginning. The implications hit Patricia immediately. That's a serious conflict of interest. If Steinberg's employee was involved in the affair that led to the divorce, and he's representing Mark? Exactly. But wait, there's more. Julia's smile was sharp now, predatory. Amber has quite the social media presence. Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, all public profiles. And she loves to document everything, including their relationship. Julia showed Patricia a series of Instagram posts dating back 7 months. Amber at expensive restaurants with mystery dinner dates. Designer shopping trips with captions like, "When Bae says get whatever you want." Vacation photos. From the Bahamas with Mark's reflection clearly visible in her sunglasses. She's been flaunting their relationship online while he was still married to you, Patricia observed. And funding it with money from your joint accounts. The Bahamas trip was particularly interesting, Julia continued. It was the same week Mark told me he had to go to a mandatory legal seminar in Springfield. I actually called the hotel he said he was staying at. He was never registered there. Patricia was taking notes furiously. This is good, Julia. Very good. But we need more financial documentation. If Mark has been moving assets, already on it. Julia pulled out a manila folder. I got copies of all our financial statements going back 3 years. I also tracked down every credit card and investment account. And I found something interesting. She spread out several documents. Mark opened a new account at Chase Bank 4 months ago. The same week he started pulling money out of our joint savings. The account is in his name only, but I was able to get some information about it. How? Julia's smile was mysterious. I may work at a community center, but I have friends in useful places. Carmen's ex-boyfriend works at Chase. He couldn't give me account details, but he could confirm that Mark has been making regular large deposits, always in cash or certified checks. That's our smoking gun, Patricia said. He's been systematically moving marital assets into an account you can't access, which is illegal during divorce proceedings. There's something else, Julia said quietly. I hired a private investigator. Patricia's eyebrows shot up. You did what? His name is Carlos Mendoza. He's a retired Chicago PD detective who now works private cases. Carmen recommended him. He helped her neighbor catch her husband cheating last year. Julia pulled out a business card. He's been following Mark and Amber for 2 weeks. Julia, I have to advise you to be careful about. It's all legal. Julia interrupted. Carlos made sure of that. He only follows them in public places, only takes photos from public property. But what he's found is illuminating. She handed Patricia a manila envelope. Inside were dozens of photos. Mark and Amber house hunting in Lincoln Park, looking at properties well outside Mark's declared income range. Mark and Amber at a jewelry store, apparently shopping for wedding rings. Mark and Amber meeting with a financial advisor at a downtown office building. This last one is particularly interesting. Julia pointed to a photo of Mark shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit outside a bank. That's Jonathan Hartwell, a private wealth manager who specializes in offshore accounts. Carlos confirmed the meeting happened last week. Patricia studied the photos with growing amazement. Julia, this is incredible work. But why didn't you tell me you were doing this? Because I needed to be sure. I needed to know that I wasn't being paranoid or vindictive. I needed proof that everything I suspected was true. Julia's voice was steady now, filled with quiet determination. Mark thinks he's so smart that he's planned everything perfectly. But he made one crucial mistake. What's that? He underestimated me. He always has. To him, I was just the supportive wife who handled the house and stayed out of his important business affairs. He never realized that working at the community center meant I deal with people trying to hide assets and manipulate the system every day. I've learned to spot the signs. Patricia leaned back in her booth, a slow smile spreading across her face. You know what, Julia? I think Mark is about to get the surprise of his life. Oh, I'm counting on it. Julia gathered up the documents, her movements crisp and efficient. I want to hit him with everything at once. The hidden assets, the affair timeline, the conflict of interest with his lawyer. I want to walk into that courtroom prepared for war. War it is, Patricia agreed. But Julia, you need to prepare yourself. This is going to get ugly. Mark clearly isn't above playing dirty, and when he realizes what we have on him, let him try, Julia said, her voice carrying a steel that Patricia hadn't heard before. I'm not the same woman who walked into that courtroom 3 days ago. I'm not going to be his victim anymore. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Marisol appeared again with a to-go container. Para tu casa, she said, pressing the container into Julia's hands. And mija, whatever that cabron did to you, you're better off without him. A real man doesn't parade his querida around like that. Julia hugged the older woman, feeling supported by the solidarity of women who understood betrayal. Gracias, Mari. You're right. I am better off without him. Walking to their cars, Patricia turned to Julia one last time. I have to ask, are you sure you want to go this route? We could probably negotiate a reasonable settlement without all the drama. Julia looked back at the cafe where she'd spent so many evenings with Mark in their early years, where they'd talked about their dreams and plans for the future. Those dreams had been built on lies, but her strength was real. Patricia, 3 days ago, I would have said yes. I would have taken whatever settlement kept the peace and let me disappear quietly. But Mark made a choice when he brought that woman to our divorce hearing. He chose humiliation over dignity. He chose cruelty over kindness. Julia's eyes hardened. So no, I don't want reasonable. I want justice. And I want him to understand that actions have consequences. Then let's give him a lesson he'll never forget. As Julia drove home to her empty house, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Excitement. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't just reacting to Mark's moves. She was making her own. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The Cook County Courthouse felt different when Julia walked through its doors 2 weeks later. The same limestone steps, the same metal detectors, the same marble floors. But everything had changed. This time, Julia wasn't the devastated wife walking into an ambush. This time, she was ready for battle. Patricia met her in the lobby, looking every inch the formidable legal warrior in her charcoal power suit. You look ready, she observed, taking in Julia's professional navy dress and the steel in her eyes. I've never been more ready for anything in my life, Julia replied, adjusting the leather portfolio that contained their ammunition. Is Carlos? Here. He's already inside, along with your sister. And Julia? Patricia's smile was sharp. Our surprise witness arrived this morning. The surprise witness was Patricia's stroke of genius, Jonathan Hartwell's former assistant, a woman named Rebecca Chen, who had quit Hartwell's firm the previous month after refusing to participate in what she called questionable financial practices. Rebecca had agreed to testify about the offshore account consultations, bringing with her copies of documents that Hartwell thought had been destroyed. As they walked toward courtroom 506, Julia caught sight of a familiar figure near the elevators. Carlos Mendoza looked exactly like what he was, a retired cop who'd seen everything. Stocky build, graying mustache, and eyes that missed nothing. He nodded to Julia with professional respect. Everything's in place, he said quietly. And I've got some last-minute intelligence you're going to find very interesting. What kind of intelligence? Patricia asked. Carlos glanced around, then lowered his voice. Mark and Amber had dinner at Gibson's last night. They were celebrating. Apparently, Mark told her the divorce would be finalized today, and they could start planning their wedding. He also mentioned that his lawyer assured him Julia would walk away with minimal assets. Julia felt her jaw clench. Did he now? There's more. Amber posted about it on her Instagram story. She literally captioned a photo of her engagement ring, with finally getting rid of the dead weight, new life, new me. The post is still up. The casual cruelty of it hit Julia like a slap. Dead weight. 15 years of marriage, and she was dead weight to be discarded. But instead of devastation, she felt clarity. Crystal clear, ice-cold clarity. "Perfect," she said, her voice steady. "Let's go end this." Walking into the courtroom, Julia immediately noticed the difference in Mark's demeanor. He was practically bouncing with confidence, whispering animatedly to Steinberg and occasionally squeezing Amber's hand. Amber, for her part, was dressed in white. Actual white, as if she were making some kind of statement about purity or new beginnings. The irony wasn't lost on Julia. Judge Thornton entered, and the familiar ritual of rising and being seated played out. But this time, Julia noticed the judge's sharp eyes taking in every detail of the courtroom dynamics. Margaret Thornton hadn't built her reputation by missing subtleties. "We're here today to continue the matter of Martinez versus Martinez," the judge announced. "Counsel, I trust you're prepared to proceed with asset division and settlement discussions?" Steinberg stood first, his confidence evident. "Yes, Your Honor. My client has prepared a generous settlement offer that we believe will resolve this matter quickly and amicably." He handed a document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Julia watched as Judge Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly as she read the terms. It was clearly not generous at all. "Mrs. Martinez," the judge said, "have you had an opportunity to review this settlement offer?" Patricia stood. "We have, Your Honor, and I'm afraid my client finds the terms inadequate." "Inadequate?" Steinberg's voice carried a note of theatrical surprise. "Your Honor, my client is offering Mrs. Martinez the house, half of his declared assets, and reasonable spousal support. Given that she contributed minimal income to the marriage and has no significant career prospects, we believe this is more than fair." The condescension in his voice was intentional, designed to belittle Julia and make her seem like a burden rather than a partner. But Julia had expected this tactic. Patricia's response was surgical in its precision. "Your Honor, my client has several concerns about the accuracy of Mr. Martinez's financial disclosures. We'd like to present evidence that suggests the asset division is based on incomplete information." Judge Thornton leaned forward. "What kind of evidence, Counselor?" "Financial records showing that Mr. Martinez has systematically moved marital assets to accounts that were not disclosed in his initial filings. We also have evidence of undisclosed income and potential conflicts of interest that may have compromised the integrity of these proceedings." Steinberg was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, these are serious accusations that my client categorically denies. If opposing counsel has evidence, they should have disclosed it in discovery." "We're prepared to present everything now," Patricia replied smoothly, "starting with bank records showing $50,000 in cash withdrawals from joint accounts that Mr. Martinez cannot adequately explain." Julia watched Mark's face carefully. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely surprised and worried. "Your Honor," Steinberg said, "my client explained those withdrawals were for legitimate business expenses." "Which business?" Patricia interrupted. "We've contacted his law firm's accounting department. No business expenses in those amounts. Were submitted for reimbursement during the relevant time period." The judge's attention was fully engaged now. "Mr. Steinberg, I'm going to need your client to provide detailed documentation for those withdrawals." "Of course, Your Honor. However, I'd like to note that these aggressive tactics seem designed to prolong these proceedings unnecessarily." "Your Honor," Patricia's voice cut through his objection like a blade. "We also have evidence that Mr. Martinez has been consulting with private wealth managers about offshore banking options, and that these consultations occurred after the filing of divorce papers, which would constitute improper dissipation of marital assets." The courtroom went dead silent. Julia could see Mark whispering urgently to Steinberg, his earlier confidence evaporating. Amber looked confused, clearly not understanding the legal implications of what was being discussed. Judge Thornton's expression had shifted from professional interest to serious concern. "Counselor, these are grave allegations. I hope you have substantial proof." "We do, Your Honor. We'd like to call our first witness." Rebecca Chen took the stand with quiet dignity. Her testimony was devastating in its precision. Yes, she had worked for Jonathan Hartwell. Yes, she remembered Mark Martinez consulting about moving assets to offshore accounts. Yes, she had been asked to prepare preliminary paperwork for establishing financial structures that would be divorce-proof. Under Patricia's questioning, Rebecca described meeting after meeting where Mark had discussed the best ways to hide assets from his wife. She produced copies of emails, financial projections, and consultation notes that painted a picture of calculated deception. Steinberg's cross-examination was aggressive, but ineffective. Rebecca had kept meticulous records and had already verified the authenticity of her documents with her former employer. "Your Honor," Patricia continued, "we'd also like to present evidence regarding the timeline of Mr. Martinez's relationship with Ms. Sinclair and how it relates to his financial planning." Carlos took the stand next, his law enforcement background lending credibility to his testimony. He methodically presented the surveillance evidence, photos, timeline documentation, and records of Mark and Amber's activities that directly contradicted Mark's claims about when the marriage had ended. But the real bombshell came when Patricia introduced Amber's social media posts as evidence. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit H, a series of social media posts from Ms. Sinclair's public Instagram account that document her relationship with Mr. Martinez." On the courtroom's display screen, Amber's posts appeared in chronological order: expensive dinners, luxury shopping trips, vacation photos, all funded by money from Julia's marriage, while Mark was still living at home and claiming to work on their relationship. The posts were damning, but the captions were worse. Comments about my sugar daddy and jokes about trading up from Mark's previous relationship. And then, the final post from the night before. Finally getting rid of the dead weight. New life, new me. Julia watched Amber's face go pale as her own words were read aloud in the courtroom. This was her social media presence, her own documented celebration of destroying someone else's marriage. Judge Thornton's expression had moved from concern to barely contained anger. "Mr. Steinberg, does your client care to explain these financial discrepancies and this timeline?" Steinberg was scrambling now, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "Your Honor, my client, we'd like to request a recess to review these documents." "I'm sure you would," the judge replied coolly. "But we're not finished yet. Ms. Hendricks, do you have additional evidence?" Patricia stood, and Julia could see the satisfaction in her posture. "Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to present evidence regarding a conflict of interest that may have compromised these proceedings from the beginning." The next revelation hit the courtroom like a tsunami. Patricia presented documentation showing that Amber Sinclair was employed by Steinberg's law firm, that she had access to confidential client information, and that her relationship with Mark had begun while he was already consulting with Steinberg about divorce proceedings. "Your Honor," Patricia continued, her voice carrying the weight of righteousness, "Ms. Sinclair had access to privileged information about divorce strategy and asset protection. Her relationship with Mr. Martinez represents a clear conflict of interest that has compromised the integrity of his legal representation." Steinberg was on his feet, objecting frantically, but the damage was done. The judge's face showed exactly what she thought of lawyers who allowed their employees to sleep with clients while those clients were engaged in adversarial proceedings against their spouses. But Patricia wasn't done. The final piece of evidence was the most damaging of all: financial records showing that Mark had been paying for Amber's lifestyle with marital assets while simultaneously claiming poverty to reduce his spousal support obligations. "Your Honor," Patricia concluded, "Mr. Martinez has engaged in systematic fraud, perjury, and manipulation of these proceedings. He has dissipated marital assets, hidden income, and worked with his attorney to present false information to this court. My client has been subjected to not only the emotional trauma of an affair, but also financial fraud designed to leave her with nothing while he starts a new life funded by money from their marriage. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Amber quietly crying. Mark looked like he'd been hit by a truck, his face gray with the realization that his carefully constructed plan had collapsed completely. Judge Thornton's voice when she finally spoke was ice cold. Mr. Martinez, in 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a calculated attempt to defraud both the court and an opposing party. Mr. Steinberg, I'm extremely disappointed in the ethical lapses that have occurred under your representation. She turned her attention to Mark directly. Mr. Martinez, you will provide a complete accounting of all marital assets within 10 days, including any offshore accounts, hidden investments, or assets transferred to third parties. You will also provide documentation for every withdrawal from joint accounts over the past 12 months. Mark's voice was barely a whisper. Your Honor, I'm not finished. Judge Thornton cut him off. Furthermore, I'm ordering an immediate freeze on all accounts identified in these proceedings pending a complete forensic audit. And Mr. Martinez? I'm referring this matter to the Illinois State Bar Association for investigation of potential criminal fraud. The implications hit Mark like a sledgehammer. A state bar investigation could end his legal career. Criminal fraud charges could mean prison time. His perfect plan hadn't just failed, it had destroyed him. But Judge Thornton wasn't done delivering justice. As for the settlement, she continued, given the evidence of asset dissipation and fraud presented today, I'm awarding Mrs. Martinez 70% of all marital assets, including any assets that were improperly transferred or hidden. Mr. Martinez will also pay her attorney's fees and investigative costs, 70%. Julia felt her head spin. She'd walked into this courtroom hoping for a fair 50-50 split. Instead, Mark's own greed and cruelty had earned her much more. Additionally, the judge continued, I'm awarding Mrs. Martinez permanent spousal support in the amount of $4,000 per month to be paid from Mr. Martinez's earnings. This support is non-modifiable due to the fraudulent behavior exhibited in these proceedings. Mark looked like he might be sick. $4,000 a month was more than his mortgage payment. Combined with losing 70% of their assets, he'd be financially crippled for years. Amber was no longer quietly crying. She was sobbing openly, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. The wealthy lawyer she'd planned to marry was about to be broke, possibly disbarred, and potentially facing criminal charges. Her sugar daddy had just turned into a liability. Your Honor, Steinberg made one last desperate attempt. My client requests time to... Your client had months to be honest about his assets, Mr. Steinberg. He chose deception instead. Judge Thornton's voice brooked no argument. This court is adjourned. I expect full compliance with these orders within the specified timeframes. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. Julia sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. She'd won. Not just won, she'd achieved complete victory. Patricia leaned over, her voice filled with satisfaction. Julia, in 25 years of practice, I've never seen a more complete reversal of fortune. You didn't just win your divorce, you obliterated him. Across the courtroom, Mark was having an animated, whispered argument with Steinberg. Julia couldn't hear the words, but the lawyer's body language suggested he was distancing himself from his client as quickly as possible. Professional self-preservation in action. Amber had stopped crying and was staring at Mark with an expression Julia recognized, the look of someone realizing they'd bet on the wrong horse. The designer life she'd planned was evaporating before her eyes. Carlos appeared at Julia's elbow, his professional demeanor cracking into a rare smile. Mrs. Martinez, that was beautiful to watch. Justice served ice cold. Carmen pushed through the gallery to reach Julia, tears streaming down her face. Hermana, Abuela would be so proud. You fought like a Martinez woman. As they prepared to leave the courtroom, Mark finally looked directly at Julia for the first time since the proceedings began. The confidence, the smugness, the casual cruelty, all of it was gone. In its place was something Julia had never seen in his eyes before. Fear. He started to approach her, but Patricia stepped between them. Mr. Martinez, any communication with my client needs to go through me. Julia, please. Mark's voice was desperate. We can work this out. We don't need to what? Julia's voice was steady, controlled. We don't need justice. We don't need honesty. We don't need consequences for your actions. She stepped around Patricia, looking at the man she'd been married to for 15 years, as if seeing him clearly, for the first time. Mark, you made your choices. You chose to lie, to cheat, to steal from our marriage. You chose to humiliate me in this courtroom with your mistress. You chose to treat me like I was worthless. Her voice grew stronger with each word. But you made one crucial mistake. You forgot that I'm not the naive girl you married 15 years ago. I'm a woman who's learned to stand up for herself. And today, you learned what happens when you underestimate a Martinez woman. Mark's face crumpled. Julia, I'm sorry. I know I made mistakes, but we can... The only mistake here was mine, Julia interrupted. I wasted 15 years believing you were a good man. But good men don't parade their affairs in divorce court. Good men don't steal from their wives. Good men don't celebrate getting rid of dead weight. Amber flinched at the reference to her social media post, finally understanding how her own words had been used against them. Enjoy your new life together, Julia continued, her voice calm, but final. I hope it was worth it. As Julia walked toward the courtroom exit, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Freedom, not just from Mark, but from the version of herself that had accepted his treatment, that had made excuses for his behavior, that had believed she deserved less than she was worth. The courthouse steps that had felt like a mountain on that first day now felt like a victory podium. Julia Martinez, newly single, financially secure, and finally free, walked down them with her head held high. So what now? Patricia asked as they reached the sidewalk. Julia looked back at the courthouse, where her old life had officially ended and her new one had begun. Now? Now I start living for myself. Maybe I'll travel. Maybe I'll go back to school. Maybe I'll start that nonprofit I always dreamed about. She pulled out her phone and opened her camera app. But first, I'm going to do something I should have done a long time ago. She took a selfie on the courthouse steps, her smile genuine for the first time in months. The caption she posted on her own social media was simple. Justice served. New life begins now. Strength over betrayal. Martinez woman. Within minutes, the likes and supportive comments began pouring in from friends and family who had watched her suffer through the divorce proceedings. The community center where she worked, former colleagues, old friends, all celebrating her victory and her strength. As they walked to their cars, Carlos handed Julia a final manila envelope. Congratulations, Mrs. Martinez. These are copies of everything for your records, and if you ever need a private investigator again. Hopefully I won't, Julia laughed. But thank you, Carlos. You helped me get my life back. Patricia paused. At her car door. Julia, I have to ask, what are you going to do about the house? It's yours now, but... Julia considered this. The house held 15 years of memories, both good and bad. It was beautiful, valuable, and completely paid off thanks to the settlement. But it was also the place where Mark had lied to her face, every day for months. I think I'm going to sell it, she decided. Start completely fresh. Maybe get a condo downtown, closer to work. Or maybe... She paused, a new idea forming. Maybe I'll use some of the money to buy that building the community center has been trying to purchase. Turn it into a resource center for women going through divorces. Help other women who are where I was 6 months ago. Patricia's smile was warm with approval. That sounds perfect. And Julia? If you do that, you'll need legal help setting it up. I'd be honored to help. As Julia drove home, to the house that was now entirely hers, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman who defined herself through her marriage, who'd lost herself in trying to be the perfect supportive wife. The woman driving home today was different, stronger, more confident, ready to build a life based on her own dreams and values, not someone else's expectations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. Dinner at Cafe Luna tonight? We're celebrating. Julia smiled, typing back. Absolutely. And Carmen? Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. The response came immediately. That's what sisters are for, Hermana. Abuela always said Martinez women were survivors. Today, you proved her right. As Julia pulled into her driveway, she noticed something she'd never paid attention to before. The garden she'd planted years ago, neglected during the months of marriage turmoil, was blooming. Despite the lack of care, despite the harsh Chicago winter, despite everything, it had survived and was thriving, just like her. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Julia stood in front of a renovated warehouse in Pilsen, watching contractors install a sign that read, Nueva Vida Women's Resource Center. The morning sun caught the fresh paint on the building's facade, and she couldn't help but smile at how perfectly the light seemed to illuminate her new purpose. It's beautiful, mija, Carmen said, joining her sister on the sidewalk. Abuela would cry happy tears seeing this. The resource center had been Julia's dream project, funded by her divorce settlement and her newfound determination to help other women navigate the treacherous waters of divorce and domestic challenges. The building housed legal aid services, financial counseling, job training programs, and support groups. Everything Julia wished she'd had access to when her world was falling apart. The grand opening is next week, Julia said, consulting her tablet. Patricia will be here to discuss legal rights, Carlos is doing a workshop on documenting abuse and infidelity, and we have 3 women ready to share their success stories. Carmen nudged her playfully. And what about you? Ready to share your story? Julia considered this. Her divorce had become something of a legend in Chicago's legal community, the case study in how hidden assets and courtroom arrogance could backfire, spectacularly. But more importantly, it had become a source of hope for other women facing similar betrayals. I've been thinking about that, Julia admitted. Maybe it's time. Her phone buzzed with a notification from her Instagram account, which had grown exponentially since she'd started sharing her journey of rebuilding after divorce. Today's post was a photo of the resource center with the caption, "Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you'll ever do. New life. Strength after betrayal. Women supporting women." The comments were already pouring in. Women sharing their own stories, asking for advice, offering support to each other. What had started as a personal documentation of healing had evolved into a community of survivors helping survivors. Speaking of success stories, Carmen said with a mischievous grin, "How's Dr. Rodriguez?" Julia felt her cheeks warm. Miguel Rodriguez was a psychologist who'd volunteered to help design the mental health services for the resource center. Their professional collaboration had gradually evolved into something more personal. Long conversations over coffee, shared laughs during planning meetings, and an easy comfort that Julia had forgotten was possible with a man. Miguel is wonderful, Julia admitted. But we're taking things slow. I'm not the same person I was when I married Mark, and I want to make sure I know who I am before I become part of we again. Smart woman, Carmen approved. Though I have to say, the way he looks at you during those board meetings, that man is smitten. Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice. Julia? Julia Martinez? They turned to see a young woman approaching hesitantly. She was maybe 28, with tired eyes and nervous energy that Julia recognized. Immediately, "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman continued, "but I saw your posts online about the resource center. I think I need help." Julia's expression immediately shifted to one of focused compassion. "Of course. I'm Julia, and this is my sister Carmen. What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Williams." The woman glanced around nervously. "I'm going through a divorce, and my husband, he's doing things, hiding money, making me feel crazy. When I saw what happened with your case, I thought maybe—" "You thought right," Julia said firmly. "Come on, let's go inside. I'll make coffee and you can tell me everything." As they walked into the resource center, Sarah's eyes widened at the space Julia had created. The main room was warm and welcoming, with comfortable seating areas, children's toys in one corner, and walls covered with resources and inspirational quotes in both English and Spanish. "This is amazing," Sarah breathed. "You really built all this?" "We built this," Julia corrected, gesturing to include Carmen and the community of volunteers who'd made it possible. Healing isn't a solo journey. Over the next hour, Sarah's story unfolded with heartbreaking familiarity. A husband who controlled the finances, made her feel stupid for asking questions, had become increasingly cruel as she'd grown more independent. The gaslighting, the isolation, the systematic erosion of self-worth, Julia had lived it all. "The worst part," Sarah said, tears flowing freely, "is that I know he's cheating. I've seen the messages, the credit card bills for restaurants I've never been to. But he makes me feel like I'm paranoid, like I'm the problem." Julia handed her tissues, remembering her own journey from confusion to clarity. "Sarah, you're not paranoid. You're not the problem. And you're not alone." She pulled out a folder and began explaining the resources available: legal aid, financial counseling, support groups, even temporary housing assistance for women who needed to leave dangerous situations. "But more than that," Julia continued, "I want you to understand something that took me too long to learn. Your worth isn't determined by whether he chooses to value you. Your worth is inherent, and anyone who tries to diminish it is telling you more about themselves than about you." Sarah nodded, hope beginning to replace despair in her eyes. "How did you find the strength to fight back?" Julia considered the question. "Seriously, I think it started with getting angry. Really angry. Not just hurt or sad, but furious at the injustice of it all. That anger gave me energy. But what sustained me was remembering who I was before him and imagining who I could become after him. Was it worth it? The fight, I mean?" Julia's smile was radiant. "Sarah, 6 months ago, I was a woman who defined herself through her marriage to a man who didn't respect her. Today, I'm running a nonprofit that helps women find their strength. I have genuine friendships, I sleep peacefully, and I wake up excited about my life. So yes, it was absolutely worth it." As Sarah left with a folder full of resources and the phone number for Patricia's legal aid program, Carmen watched her sister with obvious pride. "You know what I love most about watching you with women like Sarah?" Carmen asked. "What's that?" "You're not just helping them survive their divorces. You're showing them how to transform their pain into power." Julia's phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. "Dinner tonight? I want to hear about your day, and I have some ideas for the teen mentorship program." She typed back, "Yes, but fair warning, it's been an emotional day. I might cry happy tears into my pasta." His response made her laugh. "I'll bring extra napkins. Your happy tears are some of my favorite things about you." "He's good for you," Carmen observed, reading over Julia's shoulder. "He is," Julia agreed. "But you know what? I'm good for me now too." That's the difference. As they locked up the resource center for the day, Julia took one last look at the space that represented everything she'd gained from losing everything. The setback that had felt like the end of her story had actually been the beginning of her best chapter. Her phone rang. Patricia calling with an update. "Julia, you're going to love this." Patricia's voice was practically gleeful. "Remember how Mark and Steinberg claimed his financial troubles were temporary? Well, the Barr investigation concluded. Steinberg's been suspended for 6 months and Mark, let's just say his legal career isn't recovering anytime soon." "What about Amber?" Julia found herself asking. Yes, the former fiancé. Apparently she broke up with Mark about 2 weeks after the final judgment. Something about not signing up to date a broke man with legal problems. She's moved on to a plastic surgeon in Naperville. Julia surprised herself by feeling a moment of pity for Mark. Not regret. Never regret. But a sadness for the life he'd destroyed through his own choices. "Julia, you okay?" Patricia asked. "I'm perfect," Julia realized, and meant it. "Thank you for everything, Patricia. Not just the legal work, but for helping me find my strength. Honey, I didn't help you find anything. I just helped you remember what was always there." That evening, over dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy, Julia shared the day's events with Miguel. He listened with the focused attention she'd learned to expect from him, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights from his own work with trauma survivors. "You know what strikes me about your story?" he said as they shared tiramisu. "Most people who go through what you experienced become either bitter or broken. You chose a third option. Which is? You chose to become better. Not just healed, but transformed. You took the worst experience of your life and used it to create something beautiful." Julia reached across the table to take his hand. "Miguel, can I tell you something?" "Always." A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting here tonight, running my own nonprofit, helping other women, feeling genuinely happy, I would have thought they were crazy. I was so lost in being Mark's wife that I'd forgotten how to be Julia. And now I know exactly who Julia is. She's strong, compassionate, resilient, and worthy of love. She's also someone who doesn't need saving, but who appreciates a partner who supports her dreams instead of diminishing them. Miguel's smile was warm and genuine. "Well, Julia Martinez is pretty extraordinary, and I feel lucky to be part of her life." As they walked back to their cars, Julia's phone lit up with notifications. Women commenting on her Instagram posts, sharing their own stories, supporting each other through difficult times. The community she'd inadvertently created was thriving. Women lifting each other up instead of tearing each other down. "I have an idea," she told Miguel. "What if we expanded the resource center model, franchised it to other cities? You want to start a movement? I want to make sure no woman has to face what I faced alone. I want every woman to know that betrayal doesn't define her. How she responds to it does." Miguel stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Julia, do you realize what you're talking about? A national network of women's resource centers would be a massive undertaking." "I know," she said, her eyes bright with possibility. "Isn't it exciting?" Later that night, alone in her downtown condo, the space she'd created just for herself, decorated with art she loved and filled with books she wanted to read, Julia reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The woman who'd walked into that courthouse a year ago, devastated by her husband's betrayal and public humiliation, felt like a different person entirely. That woman had seen herself as a victim, defined by what had been done to her. The woman looking back at her from her bathroom mirror tonight was a survivor who'd become a thriver. She'd transformed her pain into purpose, her betrayal into a mission, her ending into a beginning. She pulled out her laptop and began typing. To the woman reading this who's in the middle of her own storm. "I see you. I was you, I know you feel broken, humiliated, lost. I know you're wondering if you'll ever feel whole again, if you'll ever trust again, if you'll ever be happy again. The answer is yes. But not the same happiness you had before. Something better. Happiness that comes from knowing your own worth. Strength that comes from surviving your worst day. Peace that comes from no longer needing anyone else's approval to feel valuable. Your betrayal story doesn't end with what he did to you. It ends with what you do next. And what you do next is entirely up to you. Choose strength. Choose growth. Choose yourself. You are not broken. You are breaking open. And that's where the light gets in. With love and solidarity, Julia Martinez, founder, Nueva Vida Women's Resource Center. She posted the letter on her blog, then closed her laptop and looked out her window at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere out there were women facing their own courtroom, betrayals, their own moments of devastating revelation. But they weren't alone anymore. Julia Martinez had turned her worst day into her mission, and she was just getting started. The phoenix had risen, and she was ready to help others find their wings.